Welcome to the debate. Today we're tackling, well, a claim that many might just dismiss out of hand, maybe even find a bit frivolous. But when you really apply some rigorous philosophical and logical thinking to it, it actually brings up some surprisingly deep intellectual challenges. You know, the real test of how we reason isn't always debating the easily provable, but sometimes debating the necessary. So our central question today, we're framing it as a formal proposition, resolved. Santa Claus exists. I'll be arguing for the affirmative, basically making the case that Santa Claus holds a kind of verifiable existence, one that's rooted in, let's say, cultural necessity. The profound reliability, I'd argue, of universal testimony, and just the undeniable reality of these huge, observable global phenomena every year. I'm approaching this claim, well, much like you might approach certain deep theological or maybe sociological questions.
Right, and I'll be taking the opposing view here, arguing the negative. My job, as I see it, is to apply the principles of logic, physical law, and philosophical parsimony, Occam's razor, essentially, to this claim. We have to be really rigorous, I think, in distinguishing between myth, which, can be a powerful, impactful cultural idea, and literal ontological reality, a being that actually is. My goal is to sort of dismantle the idea that we need some kind of supernatural entity to explain what are fundamentally cultural phenomena.
Okay, so let's begin the affirmative case. We can start with something like what we might call the cosmological or origin argument, but adapted for sociology, if you will. Just like some argue the universe itself requires a cause, we assert that the global Christmas phenomenon, the coordinated, practically universal appearance of billions of specific, individually addressed gifts under trees across continents, all on December 25th, that requires an efficient, central origin. This massive, consistent, logistical feat, which has been sustained for centuries, it really needs an explanation that goes beyond just saying, oh, it's a shared tradition. Because claiming that universal, global, parental coordination, totally decentralized, kept secret across every culture, every economic class, claiming that's the sole cause for this tradition's persistence. That really strains credibility, doesn't it? Statistically, logistically, it seems implausible.
Santa Claus, I argue, actually offers the most coherent and maybe even the most parsimonious explanation for this massive yearly event. And this brings me to my second point, functional existence. Look, if belief in Santa Claus produces these colossal, real-world measurable effects, I'm talking reshaping global shopping, generating billions in economic activity, and maybe most importantly, tangible changes in children's moral conduct, then Santa exists in a meaningful, functional sense. You can think of it like a shared belief system, maybe like a corporation, or even a currency. These aren't physical objects in the same way a rock is physical, but their existence as shared concepts drive profound material outcomes. Santa's functional existence, shaping global economic and ethical behavior, well, that's a form of existence we really can't just ignore.
Okay, I have to jump in there because I'm sorry, but I just don't think that holds up. You're taking a powerful cultural manifestation, yes, absolutely, huge psychological and economic impact, but you're trying to equate that impact with a literal ontological entity? A being that actually, lives and breathes and travels through space? That's a huge philosophical leap, and I don't think we can make it without stronger justification. We really need definitional clarity here. Ontological existence refers to reality in the truest sense, the actual being of something. Traditions, powerful ideas, they often emerge and persist without needing a literal being to anchor them. Think about the concept of justice. It drives our entire legal system, but justice isn't actually a goddess standing there holding scales, right? And for Santa, we have documented historical origins that completely remove the need for, magical intervention. We know about the charitable acts of St. Nicholas of Myra, the evolution through European folklore, and, critically, the large-scale commercial invention and standardization mostly in the 19th and 20th centuries. There's no great historical mystery here demanding a supernatural gift giver. And furthermore, regarding your point on functional existence, the simplest explanation, what philosophers call philosophical parsimony or Occam's razor, it fully explains the phenomena without adding extra entities. Parents buy and place the gifts. Children, conditioned by this incredibly powerful and widespread cultural narrative, adjust their behavior accordingly. We must rigorously distinguish between the profound psychological impact of the idea of Santa, which is undeniable, and the literal fact of a physical, supernatural entity. Just because an idea is effective, shaping GDP or behavior, that simply doesn't grant literal physical existence to the figure in that idea.
I see why you'd think that, especially if you're defining existence so narrowly, purely in material terms. But let me offer a different perspective on the quality and sheer scale of the evidence we actually have. Let's focus on what we can call experiential claims. We aren't talking about a few isolated anecdotes here. We're talking about millions of children, spanning centuries, spanning continents, reporting remarkably consistent, first-hand experiences. You know, stockings filled, specific cookies eaten, gifts appearing seemingly out of nowhere, ex nihilo. The consistency, the sheer scale of this universal testimony across different socioeconomic backgrounds, different geographical locations, it demands serious consideration, I think. If you just dismiss this massive body of consistent witness data as mere cultural conditioning or fabrication, then why do we rely so heavily on individual, often contradictory testimonies in, say, our courts of law? Or on historical testimony to confirm events from millennia ago? If testimony is foundational to human knowledge, the sheer breadth of the Santa testimony should, at least, give us pause before we dismiss it so easily.
Okay. That's a compelling point based on scale. I'll grant you that. But have you really considered the source, the material reality of that testimony? You're basing your strongest claim on arguably the least reliable source data imaginable, the youngest, most impressionable demographic. Children, those who are naturally susceptible to influence, to misperception, and to the powerful suggestion inherent in a shared cultural myth, especially when it's delivered by authority figures, namely their parents. If we accept the collective anecdotal testimony of children as prima facie evidence, that is acceptable on its face, of a literal logistical being traveling the globe, well, logically, we then open the door to accepting every other form of unreliable collective testimony. Things like large-scale ghost sightings, mass hysteria events, maybe even UFO reports, all on the exact same evidentiary basis.
The key difference here, though, is the mechanism. In the Santa case, the source data is structurally compromised because it's actively, persistently primed by the adult population. The reports of sleigh bells or cookie consumption, they are perfectly logically explained by the direct involvement of the verifiable actors, the adults in the house.
But let's pivot away from pure testimony for a moment then, and consider the function he serves. That's an interesting point on the reliability of the witnesses, I admit, though I would frame the function rather differently. Perhaps looking at necessity. Let's look at the moral and ethical argument. I'd argue Santa isn't just a convenient symbol. He is, in a way, necessary. He serves as a powerful, almost universal moral compass, a figure who watches, judges, and rewards based on virtue, goodness, kindness. This figure shapes behavior on a truly massive scale. The universality of this benevolent, watchful archetype, whether you call him Santa Claus, Father Christmas, Dead Moroz, whatever, it suggests not just a handy social tool, but maybe an underlying human need. It seems to confirm that foundational ethical development, especially for young minds, benefits from having such a centralized, benevolent figure who reinforces kindness and virtue.
The resulting behavior isn't merely conditioned, like training an animal. It's positively shaped toward a universally desired ethical outcome.
I appreciate the functionalist argument, I really do. But again, symbolic existence simply does not translate into literal existence. And the idea that Santa is somehow necessary for moral conduct, well, it collapses pretty quickly when we look at the global evidence. This narrative is a classic example of a symbolic social construct. Parents use the myth, consciously or not, to incentivize good behavior, precisely because they are the agents of control, the ones actually delivering the rewards. I mean, if Santa were truly necessary for virtue, how do entire cultures that don't celebrate Christmas or don't have this specific figure successfully maintain robust moral systems, high social cohesion, powerful ethical frameworks? They do it perfectly well without any need for this particular narrative. They rely on communal bonds, familial authority, religious teachings, historical traditions, and so on.
The behavior is shaped by the parent and the society, yes, but not by some magical figure operating outside of space and time. Santa might be a cultural accelerant for certain behaviors in some places, but he's certainly not a universal moral foundation.
Okay, let's address the elephant in the room then, the persistent skepticism that materialists always raise. The problem of logistics and observation. This is always the sticking point, isn't it? You cite the physical impossibility, the sheer scale of the task, but you tend to ignore the empirical data points that challenge that conventional framework. Things like the unexplained consumption of cookies and milk, consistently reported. The reality of gifts appearing that sometimes seem to exceed a family's stated financial means or, frankly, their capacity for secret shopping and hiding. And even the acknowledgement by governmental organizations like NORAD with their Santa tracker. It's playful, sure, but it taps into something real. The logistical problem that he must visit, maybe 2 billion households in one night, requiring impossible speeds and defying known physics? That's not a disproof, I argue. Instead, maybe it's powerful proof that Santa operates outside of our known conventional space-time. The phenomena, the appearance of the gifts, are real. They happen. Therefore, the mechanism must be non-conventional. To reject the mechanism solely because it defies basic Newtonian physics, or even relativistic physics as we understand it, is essentially to refuse to follow the evidence where it seems to lead. Why couldn't Santa utilize technology far beyond our understanding, perhaps manipulating relativity or using something like quantum tunneling to effectively fold time and space? His inability to be directly observed is perfectly consistent with either advanced stealth technology or perhaps magical concealment required for such a monumental task.
Look, that's a creative argument, but I have to insist on material reality here and frankly challenge your methodology. Dismissing the impossibility of, exceeding the speed of light, avoiding atmospheric vaporization from friction, and performing something like 22,000 deliveries per second by invoking speculative quantum tunneling or unknown physics, well, that's the very definition of ad hoc reasoning, isn't it? You're introducing these unevidenced, highly specialized concepts solely to save your hypothesis from what is otherwise overwhelming contradiction. Science and philosophy, for that matter, demand we prefer the simpler explanation that fits the known facts. The NORAD tracker? It's delightful. It's a wonderful piece of public engagement and entertainment, but it's not scientific data collection. And cookies and milk disappearing? That's, trivially explained by the direct actors in the drama. Parents, maybe older siblings, sometimes even the family pet. More importantly, though, let's circle back to the definitive parental evidence. The direct, primary agents in this whole process, the parents, the guardians, they consistently admit, eventually, that they buy the gifts, they wrap them, they place them under the tree. This verifiable testimony from the direct agents, the people actually doing it, vastly outweighs speculative theories about quantum sleds or space-time folding. And furthermore, the sheer infrastructural impossibility remains totally unaddressed. Billions of unique toys must be manufactured, materials sourced, energy expended on an unimaginable scale. The North Pole has been exhaustively mapped by satellites, ground-penetrating radar, GPS, you name it. There is no physical factory complex, no massive resource extraction operation, and certainly no detectable energy grid necessary to support a global, technologically advanced industrial operation capable of producing this scale of material goods. It's just not there.
So, in closing my case, I would maintain that Santa Claus, whether understood functionally or perhaps even literally in a way we don't fully grasp, remains the most coherent, maybe even the most parsimonious, explanation when you truly weigh all the evidence, the cultural universality, the sheer scale of economic activity surrounding the holiday, and the demonstrable, positive moral behavioral outcomes produced by this widespread belief system. The inability of skeptics to definitively, physically disprove a being who might operate outside our current known physics, or whose existence is perhaps rooted more in a collective functional reality, well, that doesn't invalidate his traditional or functional existence. He's not merely a fairy tale. I'd argue he's something like the logical underpinning of one of humanity's most consistent and consequential global traditions.
And I would argue we must return to philosophical rigor and Occam's razor. I have to reaffirm the critical distinction between an idea, even an incredibly powerful idea with profound psychological and economic impact, and a literal ontological entity, a thing that actually exists independently. If we start granting existence based solely on functional effect or belief, then while every major fictional character who inspires people, every national currency, which is purely a shared belief system with tangible effects, exists in the same literal space as a physical person. The evidence points overwhelmingly towards Santa Claus being a potent, globally commercialized cultural myth, not a real being. And this conclusion is driven by overwhelming logistical and material contradictions that can only be overcome by introducing purely speculative, unevidenced physics or magic. The true debate here, then, it really seems to hinge entirely on epistemology, fundamentally. What counts as valid evidence when we're discussing existence itself? Do we prioritize consistent functional effect, long-standing cultural tradition, and widespread experiential claims, even if anecdotal? Or must we adhere strictly to verifiable physical laws, the direct testimony of the known actors involved in this case to parents, and the simplest explanation that accounts for the observed facts? It seems clear that the very definition of existence and what qualifies as proof for it is what we still need to explore further in this material.